The insatiable craving at Voodoo Donuts. A cold winter night, when the air in their quiet little town grew heavy and horrifying. Sarah was working the night shift at Voodoo Donuts, a place that always smelled of sugar and spice. But that night, the sweetness seemed suffocated. The shop felt oppressively heavy. The doorbell jingled violently as it swung open. Big Joe, a regular customer, a man with a massive frame, usually outdone only by his cheerful demeanor, had been acting differently lately. A giant donut eating contest, meant for thrill seekers, had become a nightly ritual. He'd always ask about it, wondering if anyone had completed it in under 80 seconds. But that night, he didn't just come to eat donuts. He barged in, slamming the door so hard it banged against the wall, startling everyone. He strode straight to the counter where she stood, speaking in a gruff voice.
"Tonight is the night of feasts."
She shuddered at the way he spoke, as if he wasn't really talking to her but to something behind her. Sarah hesitantly slid a tray of giant donuts across the counter. Joe grabbed it with trembling hands, his lips twitching into a deranged smile. Joe sat in his usual spot, closing his eyes and muttering unintelligibly, his large hands hovering over the tray of donuts. Without warning, he began devouring them. His movements were frantic, each bite seemingly adding to the bizarre intensity of his performance. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her unease growing stronger. Joe suddenly stood up, overturning the table. Donuts spilled onto the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. He started speaking in a strange language. From behind the counter, Sarah instinctively reached for her phone. Before she could dial, Joe grabbed a kitchen knife from the prep station nearby. Joe pointed the knife at the room, his wild eyes scanning the terrified customers.
"Eat, eat."
He lunged at a young man, pressing the knife to his throat. He held him tightly, the man sobbing as Joe picked up a donut and shoved it into his mouth. Sarah spotted an old fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. She grabbed it tightly, stepping back into the chaos. As Joe raised the knife to strike, she stealthily lunged forward, swinging the fire extinguisher with all her might. It hit Joe's head with a horrifying thud. He staggered, dropping the knife, but didn't fall. Joe turned to face her, a low growl emanating from his throat. His eyes, full of rage, locked onto Sarah. Joe staggered toward her.
"You don't understand. I am the chosen one. The feast never ends."
He picked up a donut that had fallen on the floor and shoved it into his mouth. As he ate, his breathing grew erratic. His face turned pale, sweat streaming down his forehead. Suddenly, something caught. He clutched at his chest. His massive body trembled, then collapsed to the floor with a loud thud. Silence enveloped the room. Sarah dropped the fire extinguisher. She cautiously approached Joe's motionless body, her breath ragged as she checked for a pulse. There was none. Police cars and ambulances stood outside the shop. She sat in the back of the ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her. Sarah couldn't escape the image, the final moments of Joe, his madness, and the obsession with a challenge that had led to his demise. The strangers in the elevator. It was late, and the tall apartment building loomed against the foggy sky, its dim lights flickering in the mist. The street was quiet and empty, except for the occasional sound of distant traffic. I want to take a walk to enjoy the fresh air a bit. As I walked towards the elevator, the air suddenly became cold, making me shiver. The sliding doors opened. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator began descending, but suddenly, it stopped at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened with a faint creak, and a woman was standing there. She was thin, her cheeks hollow, and her messy hair hung down over her face. Dark circles surrounded her lifeless eyes. A sense of unease crept over me as I noticed she was barefoot. She stepped inside, clutching her stomach as if in pain. Her head remained bowed, her movements slow and deliberate. I shifted uncomfortably, but something about her appearance left me confused and uneasy. Her dress was dirty, and she looked like she might be homeless. Her gaze remained fixed on the elevator floor, even though there was nothing there. When the elevator reached the first floor, I hurried out without even looking back. I quickly left the building. A little while later, I returned to the building, brushing off my thoughts, and stepped inside. As I pressed the button for the 8th floor, the elevator began to rise, but stopped again at the 6th floor. The elevator doors opened, and a horrifying sight greeted me. She was standing there, and I froze. Then, she began crawling frantically toward me. Panicking, I quickly pressed the close button, just in time before she could reach me, and the elevator doors shut. The next day, as I approached the elevator, a sense of anxiety washed over me. The elevator descended, stopping once again at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened, and this time, it was a man. He was barefoot, just like the woman. I began to whisper, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man turned to look at me, his face showing pain, mumbling and then saying,
"I've lost something. My stomach hurts so much."
Then he collapsed onto the floor, his hands searching the ground for something I couldn't see. Everything felt eerie and terrifying. When the doors opened, I bolted out of the elevator immediately, my whole body trembling with fear. I went to the management office, but they said no such person existed. Still unsettled, I went to the mailroom to pick up some things, and that's when I began to piece things together. When I opened my mailbox, one thing caught my eye: the maintenance bill for the 6th floor. 2 apartments were listed, 601 and 602, along with the water bill. Oddly, I noticed 602's water bill was abnormally high. A few nights later, I returned to my apartment after working late. When the elevator doors slid open, a large man was holding a long, heavy golf bag. It had a strange smell, a faint metallic tang wafting through the air. I glanced at the elevator control panel. The 6th floor button was lit. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, he stepped out, carrying the bag into the dark hallway toward apartment 602. I glanced down and saw tiny drops of something dark, like blood, on the floor. What was he carrying? Back in my apartment, I couldn't sit still. Finally, I picked up my phone and called the police. The police entered the building, heading straight for the 6th floor, to apartment 602. Inside apartment 602, they found a makeshift surgical room. Blood was everywhere. They also found a freezer and the suspicious golf bag. Inside were corpses. Their organs had been removed. The police uncovered evidence of organ trafficking taking place right in my building. At that moment, I asked them about the barefoot man and woman I had encountered in the elevator, but they said there was no one like that in the building as I described. I requested to see the elevator surveillance footage. When the video played, I saw myself in the elevator, but I was alone and talking to no one. I was frozen in shock. 3 days later, I received the final report from the police. The victims found were all homeless people. Those I encountered might have been spirit souls of those taken by the traffickers, still searching for something, perhaps pieces of their own bodies. Dark intentions at Dunkin' Donut. The fluorescent lights flicker above me as I sit on the edge of a narrow bed. The cold walls, the air thick with dust and time. It's been 2 years, but I remember it all as if it happened yesterday. The Dunkin' Donuts shop, the rain, and Jerry. That's where it all began. I worked the night shift at the Dunkin' Donuts in a quiet suburban town. It was a small place, nestled between an old laundromat and a thrift store. I saved what I could, putting money aside each night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job, and it kept me going. My sister usually stopped by, but tonight she wasn't there to see me. She was sitting by the window with a guy, her eyes red from crying. I couldn't hear what they were saying. but it was obvious they were arguing. She looked so distressed. He wore an old, worn coat, lingering at the door, watching the place. Tonight, he hesitated at the door, lingering longer than usual. I tried to keep my distance. There was something about him that made my skin crawl. I snapped out of my thoughts when the door creaked open, and Jerry walked in. He was irregular but always so strange. His habit of coming in at exactly 10 p.m. never failed. He shuffled to the counter, but his gaze shifted to my sister, now sitting alone, staring out the window. Jerry leaned in, asking me about her, asking if he could get her number. I clenched my jaw, trying to smile politely, but the sharpness in my voice slipped out. "Leave her alone, Jerry. Just order and go." He chuckled and said, all right, I'll have the usual." He ordered a chocolate donut and hot chocolate, which he always ordered, and went to his usual seat in the corner. I watched him eat, tearing tiny pieces off his donut, his eyes flicking toward me now and then, making me uneasy. My shift ended. It was pouring as I walked home, the streets deserted, but after a few blocks, I started hearing another set of footsteps, echoing mine, stopping when I stopped. I turned around, but no one was there, just the empty sidewalk stretching under the streetlights. I kept walking, faster, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I finally made it back to my apartment. I went into my bedroom, letting the silence envelop me. But then I saw him, Jerry, standing across the street, holding a radio. He just stood there, staring at me, the radio pressed to his ear. He pressed his head to it, then suddenly smashed it against his head with a blank, puzzled expression. Blood gushed from his head. I scrambled around the room for my phone to get help, but when I looked back, he was gone. I sat on my bed, staring out the window into the rainy night. Jerry's face kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I was sick of seeing him every night. And then, a dark thought crept into my mind, and I felt an odd satisfaction as I imagined it unfolding. I needed to teach him a lesson, to make him understand he wasn't welcome. The next night, I returned to the shop, stopping at the back to grab some supplies. I picked up a box of donuts, carefully selecting a chocolate one, just like Jerry's usual order. I pulled a small vial from my pocket, a stimulant strong enough to paralyze him for a while. I injected it into the donut, the liquid vanishing into the soft pastry. I carefully placed the donut back in the box, my heart racing as I imagined Jerry's face when he realized what was happening. I returned home and watched the rain fall outside the window. The donut sat on the dresser, a reminder of the plan forming in my head. As I sat there, an odd sense of peace washed over me. I didn't know where this road would lead, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't have to see Jerry's face staring at me anymore. Wouldn't have to endure his unsettling presence lurking on the edges of my life. The next night, I returned to the counter, watching the quiet stream of customers come and go, my mind racing with the plan I had laid out. The donut box sat in the drawer, hidden away, with one specific donut prepared for Jerry. I spent the whole day thinking about it, rehearsing the moment in my mind, imagining his face when he realized what I had done. I checked the clock. Almost 10 p.m. The door opened, and Jerry walked in, moving with his usual unsettling calm. I noticed a new scar on his forehead, a reminder of his strange behavior the night before. He glanced at the menu, but his focus was entirely on me. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, throwing it directly at my face. I could feel my anger boiling inside from his action. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the box with the special donut inside. I took him to the table, keeping my face as neutral as possible. He accepted it with a smirk. Then I went back to waiting for what I wanted. I stood still, watching Jerry slowly move his hand to the plate, and take out the donut I had prepared for him. He slowly picked it up and intended to enjoy it. I felt very satisfied and happy to be able to witness what was about to happen. I chuckled inside. But then suddenly his hand holding the cake stopped. He put it on the plate and looked away. My heart sank with disappointment. Then I saw the door open again. That's my sister. She was smiling, dressed a little more neatly than usual. When she approached the counter, then turned her eyes to Jerry, her face lit up. I stared in disbelief, piecing everything together as she looked over to his desk. Could it be that what I'm thinking right now is true? My sister said, her voice filled with excitement, "Adam, I want you to meet someone," and pointed to the table where Jerry was sitting. My sister went to his table. Then he started to act gallantly. I suddenly remembered that she also liked to eat chocolate cake. Then, with a distorted smile, he brought the cake to his mouth for my sister to eat. I felt like I was collapsing, and instead a surge of panic hit me. I ran to the table and stumbled, screaming in vain, "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking with desperation. Panic flooded the room as I knelt beside her, screaming, shaking her, hoping she'd wake up. Jerry knelt down too, his face showing real horror as he tried to help. He pressed down, trying CPR, but it was no use. She was unconscious, her face pale. That's when it hit me, had I misjudged him all along? I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed for an ambulance, my mind reeling as I realized the gravity of what I had done. The ambulance arrived, and I followed as they loaded her into the back, the siren wailing as they sped toward the hospital. The waiting room was cold, sterile, and I sat there, numb, staring at the wall, my mind racing with guilt, fear, and regret. A doctor came out, his face grim. He told me she was alive, but barely. The drug I put in the donut was enough to paralyze her temporarily, but very dangerous. She might not walk again. If there had been more, she wouldn't have survived. Relief washed over me for only a brief moment before I saw the police step into the waiting room, their eyes fixed on me. They approached, and I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The room was harshly lit, cold, and unwelcoming. They asked me questions, again and again, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them the truth, every detail, from Jerry's strange behavior to the plan I had laid out, unaware of the devastating consequences. The officer listened and told me I was lucky my sister was still alive. But I should not be mistaken. This was premeditated, and I would face the consequences. With the camera evidence and the plots I had schemed, I was now convicted, the weight of my actions bearing down on me as I was led away. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door through the cold prison bars. The world seemed distant, but the memories of that night never left me. I wondered about my sister, hoping she had healed, hoping she had moved on, and maybe, someday, she would forgive me. The truck driver's scary encounter. The night was quiet, and I was out making overnight deliveries. Miles of open road stretched before me. I glanced at the clock. It was around 2:00 a.m. I decided to stop at a truck stop to refuel and use the restroom, knowing I wouldn't have another chance for quite a while. The truck stop was deserted, except for a few empty trailers parked nearby. I filled up my tank, breathed in the fresh night air, and then headed to the restroom. The stillness was unsettling, a strange quiet that made me feel restless. With a full tank, I climbed back into the truck, heading toward a stretch of road that would take me through dense woods. It was a long, desolate road, flanked by trees on either side, with no towns, no lights, just the road and the dark forest. An hour later, I was deep in the woods, half awake and half asleep, when something caught my attention ahead. At first, I thought I was seeing things. But as I got closer, I realized there was a figure standing at the roadside. The figure was motionless, just standing there, neither waving nor calling for help. They simply watched me pass by, their face a lifeless, emotionless mask. The figure faded into the darkness behind me as I continued driving, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. About a mile later, I spotted another figure. This time, it was a woman. She stood at the roadside, wearing ripped jeans and a red sweatshirt. As I approached, our eyes met, and a wave of fear washed over me. She didn't move, didn't gesture. She simply stared, her gaze cold and unblinking. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of her as she turned her head to watch my truck go by. Her eyes locked onto mine through the glass. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to shake off the fear and keep going. I turned my attention back to the road, and my heart nearly stopped. Lying in the middle of the road was a body, sprawled out, arms and legs wide. I slammed on the brakes, the weight of the truck lurching forward as I came to a sudden stop. My mind raced as I stared at the figure lying in the road. I couldn't tell if they were dead or alive, but they were completely motionless. There were no signs of an accident, no debris, no skid marks, just this body, as if they had simply lain down in the middle of the road. I felt the need to go outside to check on them. The forest loomed on both sides, dense and dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I slowly maneuvered the truck around the body lying in the road, my heart pounding, my mind swirling with doubt. Maybe I should stop and check, just to make sure they were okay. I parked the truck a short distance away, and reluctantly, I stepped outside, but there was something about the way they were lying. I was almost there when a horrifying realization struck me. The body was no longer lying on the ground. It was standing upright, staring directly at me with empty, soulless eyes. That figure took a step forward, his movements jerky. Perhaps that was when I realized I had been lured into a trap. I turned to run back to the truck, but the figure lunged forward, moving quickly, intent on hunting me. I had no choice but to flee into the woods. Then I stumbled and fell hard to the ground. A sharp pain shot through my ankle as I tried to get up, but that figure had come closer, a malicious look on their face. I grabbed a fairly large broken branch and held it out in front of me as he slowly approached with a sinister smile. I fought back with everything I had, but he was very strong, moved quickly, and was brutal. When he kicked me in the hip, I staggered backward. I thought everything was over, but a loud explosion echoed through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw a hunter standing nearby, his rifle aimed directly at my attacker. Under the dim moonlight, the hunter's tough and determined face pulled the trigger. The attacker staggered back, clutching his shoulder, dazed for a moment. The attacker staggered, trying to flee, but he was no match for the hunter. The hunter quickly seized him, easily subduing him. He started pulling out his phone and calling the police. I fell to the ground, relief and exhaustion washing over me at the same time. Soon, the flashing lights of police cars cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest. Officers approached, weapons drawn, securing the area as they took my statement. A few days later, I learned the police's conclusion. They called me into the station for a statement and some information. I found out that the man I had encountered, the one lying in the road, was not a stranger to the area. They identified him as a notorious criminal, wanted for a series of highway robberies targeting truck drivers. He and his accomplices planned and staged fake accidents to lure drivers out of their vehicles. They would lie in wait in the woods, ready to ambush anyone who fell into their trap. The strange encounters I had with the figures by the roadside were all part of their twisted game. a psychological tactic to unsettle and confuse victims before the final act. Thanks to the intervention of the hunter and the swift response of the police, they tracked down the criminals and apprehended him. With him now facing serious charges, I knew he wouldn't be lurking in the shadows, preying on unsuspecting people any longer. Abandoned McDonald's. For the past few weeks, I had been planning a vlog to explore and uncover the rumors surrounding an abandoned McDonald's that had been circulating for years. Stories of massacres and unsolved crimes. Today, I finally made it here. As I drove towards it, my hands trembled with excitement, though the thought of experiencing it was pretty terrifying. But I believed that if this video went live, it would break all records on my channel. I arrived. It was truly an abandoned store, with peeling paint and dust-caked, grimy windows, giving it a very eerie feel. I took a deep breath and prepared to step through the door to explore. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The floor was dotted with patches of mold. The tables and chairs were arranged neatly, but covered with a thick layer of dust. I scanned my camera over the dining area, trying to capture every detail. The old menu was still there, faded and barely legible, just like the posters on the wall, all rotting from years of abandonment. I made my way towards the kitchen. Familiar machines like the ice cream maker and deep fryers were still there, but none of them were intact, all rusted beyond repair. Behind the counter, there was a large black mold patch on the floor. It sent shivers down my spine, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had decomposed into the floor. I had heard rumors that the police once found a body here. I moved forward, trying to ignore the growing unease within me. I headed towards the restroom, just as my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt something, a figure behind me. Startled, I turned around, only to see a Ronald McDonald statue grinning back at me. It didn't look anything like I remembered from my childhood. I forced a nervous laugh. I told myself it was just a statue, nothing to worry about. I continued, leaving the strange figure behind, heading towards the restroom. As I reached the restroom door, a musty smell hit my nose, but I pushed the door open anyway. I wanted to confirm a rumor that a killer had hidden a body here. I didn't know if it was true. I walked inside. There wasn't anything too unusual, just an old restroom, fairly spacious, covered in spots of stubborn moss. I felt a small sense of relief. I began panning the camera around every corner of the restroom. Maybe this place wasn't haunted like everyone said. In the end, rumors were just rumors. I left the room, but I couldn't shake off a strange feeling like I wasn't the only one here. My eyes darted to the floor, and I noticed dark stains that I hadn't seen before. I moved closer to capture them clearly on camera. Suddenly, I tripped, dropping the camera. As I bent down to pick it up, instinctively, I looked up and saw a horrifying sight right before my eyes. Hanging from the ceiling, there was a body suspended in the air, the red uniform with the unmistakable golden arches. It was a McDonald's employee. Her face was gaunt, her eye sockets empty and black, with long hair and arms swaying loosely from the ceiling. I needed to get out. My hands shook as I scrambled to grab my camera as quickly as possible. I had to leave, and fast. Now I believed the rumors were true. This place was haunted, cursed. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a police station. I told them everything, handed over my camera, and waited for them to investigate. When the police searched the restaurant, they found nothing. But what about the footage on my camera? I reviewed all the footage of the restaurant, the kitchen, the restroom, everything was there. But when it got to the part with the Ronald McDonald statue, there was no statue at all. The terrifying scenes I had witnessed, none of it was in the video. I was left speechless, with no explanation. Pizza orders at the end of the day. If you've ever worked the late shift at a delivery restaurant, then you're probably familiar with occasionally receiving a last-minute order just before closing. That day, a man placed an order for a pizza. After entering the location into the GPS, I realized that the address was far and remote. I tried to mention the inconvenience of delivering it because it was quite far, but the guy on the phone just ignored me. As I entered the address into the GPS on my phone, I realized how remote it was, and I started regretting not hanging up when I had the chance. As I drove, the winding, unfamiliar roads led me deeper into the countryside, past an old abandoned blockbuster. I recalled my mother's warning never to go beyond that place, but I never knew why. Memories of missing children and locked doors from years ago flooded back, leaving me uneasy. The dirt roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Finally, I arrived at the location, a rundown, abandoned house at the end of a muddy road. I felt a chill as I wondered if I had the right address, but the GPS confirmed that I had arrived. Leaving the pizza in the car, I approached the house to see if anyone was home. A note was taped to the door with instructions to deliver the pizza to a vehicle near the house. This struck me as odd. Why hadn't the customer mentioned this over the phone? And who asks for a pizza to be delivered to a vehicle? I was confused. Despite growing anxiety, I decided to follow the instructions since I had come this far. As I rounded the corner of the house, I was startled to see an old camper van parked with its back doors wide open. I slowly approached, hardly daring to breathe. I froze as I realized the figure was dragging something heavy, a rolled-up carpet, stained dark. The man finally moved, stepping forward into the dim light. His face remained hidden in the shadows by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel the cold and mysterious aura emanating from him. He extended a gloved hand toward me, but instead of reaching for the pizzas, he handed me an old, weathered envelope. I hesitated before taking it, sensing something unsettling. His voice was low and ominous as he told me to take the envelope to the house on the hill, a place I knew was infamous in local lore, said to be cursed. Before I could refuse, the man turned and walked back into the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness. I was left alone in the cold night, holding the envelope. I quickly turned and rushed back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine and get away. I didn't dare open the envelope, fearing what might be inside. Instead, I threw it onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove off. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, praying no one was following me. Then suddenly, that vehicle began chasing me, with the faint sound of the radio echoing behind. In a moment of desperation, I decided to floor the gas pedal and head back to the old blockbuster building, the only nearby place where I might find some cover. I pulled off the road and parked behind the building, killing the engine. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I waited until the music faded before I dared to breathe again. As I sat in the darkness, my phone finally died, plunging me into complete isolation. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was him, slowly approaching with that mysterious wide-brimmed hat. Panic began to overtake me. I fumbled to start the car, my hands trembling with fear. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car, his hands slamming against the window. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away from there. I drove straight to the police station. When I arrived, I frantically explained what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. They told me that the house where I delivered the order had been abandoned for years, and that the area was known for strange occurrences, but I knew what I had seen. Several weeks later, as I tried to move on with my life, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the same old envelope, and this time there was something inside, a small handwritten note that simply read, "We will meet again." Ghost in the gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room, as usual. Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloody child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. The Deadly Chase. A dark, secluded house appears on a quiet street, hidden by dense trees. In the dimly lit room, Emma and Nick visit the home of a new friend they met recently. His name is Gavi. They sit close, laughing and chatting together. Nick yawns, his eyes drooping, looking unusually tired. Emma notices but brushes it off, thinking he's just weary from drinking a little. Eventually, he mumbles that he needs to lie down. Emma watches him stagger into the living room, nearly stumbling, and starts to feel a bit concerned. But she doesn't notice Gavi's gaze, different from hers. His eyes follow Nick, watching with a look of satisfaction and pleasure. Left alone with Gavi, Emma feels a tense unease she can't put into words. Then he stares at her as he steps closer, his gaze cold and intense. She awkwardly avoids his gaze. Suddenly, he says, "So, let's play hide and seek." Emma feels a bit puzzled, but agrees to ease the awkwardness. Gavi's eyes remain fixed on her, darkening with something unreadable. Emma moves into the dim living room, deciding to play along, hiding under the bed. She tries to stifle a giggle, convincing herself it's just a game. Then, she hears Gavi's voice echo down the hall, his voice husky. "The time limit is 20 minutes. If I find you within that time, you'll be mine." Emma's smile fades, his words linger in her mind, and suddenly, she feels a sense of unease. She continues the game, opening the door to a dark bedroom and slipping inside. Emma crawls under the bed to hide. A sudden crash shatters the silence. The sound of breaking glass echoes down the hallway, and her unease grows with each second. She hears footsteps and objects breaking. Something heavy is being dragged, coming closer. Emma lies still, feeling strangely anxious despite knowing it's just a game. Then she hears his voice from the hallway. "You better hide well, or it won't be fun." As she's about to leave, a hammer suddenly strikes the door. Emma nearly screams in surprise, but she stifles it, covering her mouth with both hands. Then he kicked open the door and entered the room, breathing heavily and holding a massive hammer. Emma started to shiver. Was he just playing? A whirlwind of thoughts disturbed her mind. Then, after a moment, Gavi slowly swung the hammer with all his might at the cabinet. Wood splintered with a loud crack, and the wardrobe door burst open. He muttered to himself as he checked inside, then said, "Oh, she's not here too bad. If she had been hit, it would have been quite a show." Emma watched in terror as he moved, each step bringing him closer to her hiding spot. She slowly realized that this was no joke, and he was a madman. Then he lifted the hammer slowly again and circled around. Under the bed, Emma watched him move. A moment later, he stood in front of the bed. With frightening speed, Gavi ripped the mattress off the bed frame, exposing Emma's hiding spot. She froze, staring at him as he raised the hammer, eyes wide with excitement. Then he smashed the hammer into the bed frame, splintering the wood. the hammer landing inches from Emma's head. He yelled, staring through the gap at Emma, saying in sick amusement that he had missed. Emma screamed, crawling out and frantically running out of the room, with him following, dragging the hammer along the wall, his laughter echoing throughout the house. He was close behind her when suddenly the timer went off. He stopped, looked at the clock and said, "Time's up. Let's play another round." Her entire body shaking, she immediately bolted. Emma left his house, jumped into her car, and drove off, calling the police right away. They arrived at his house. When they searched, a sound came from the closet. Cautiously opening it, he lunged out, swinging the hammer wildly at the officers, injuring some severely. At that moment, Gavi was shot dead by the police on the spot, and they discovered horrific things. In his house, they found Nick dead, along with several others who had met the same fate: pale faces, sedative effects, and terrifying injuries. Gavi's guests were forced to play a twisted game, with only a few lucky ones, like Emma, chosen to survive. The unlucky ones were marked, sedated, and ultimately killed in his final sick game, which satisfied his perverse desires. The stalker in the forest. The sun barely peeked through the dense pine trees as I drove north, my truck loaded with skiing gear and camping supplies. This time, my friend Leo and I had planned a skiing trip in a remote area, miles away from any ski resort. After a few hours of driving, I parked my truck at the base of an area that looked decent with several hills. But I stopped there because I really couldn't drive any further due to the trees. Leo and I unloaded our gear, struggling to walk a quarter-mile to a clearing where we set up camp. It was an incredible amount of work with all the stuff we had to carry. In a small clearing among the trees, we pitched the tent, laid out our sleeping bags, and organized our gear. After setting up camp, we began hiking up the hill, carrying our snowboards and keeping an eye on the steep slopes. The ascent was quite challenging, but I felt thrilled as we climbed higher. We snowboarded down several slopes, one after the other. But as I neared the bottom of a slope, I lost sight of Leo. I assumed we'd meet at the base or regroup at camp. It wasn't unusual for us to take different paths down the hill. I called him on the radio, but all I got was static. Maybe he was still skiing and had started down alone. My eyes scanned the trees for any sign of him. When I reached the base of the hill, I walked and spotted another figure emerging from the woods. A skier, wearing a mask and dressed in layers. He approached me, seeming friendly beneath the ski mask, asking where the best hills were and if we were camping. He explained that he and his wife were looking for a good place to camp near others and asked if I could lead him to my campsite, though I really didn't want to. I pulled out the radio again, calling Leo to let him know I would be heading back to camp soon. The device crackled, a distorted noise cutting in, but there was no response from him at all. Then the man started following me, his presence behind me making me feel uneasy. Suddenly, I started hearing static from the other end of the radio, as if someone was trying to talk to me but couldn't connect. When we finally reached the tent, something felt off. I realized I hadn't seen his wife, so I asked where she was. He didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his movements becoming increasingly strange. But for some reason, something about his snowboard and backpack caught my attention. They felt familiar. Gray, bright orange. The snowboards tightly strapped on either side. My mind raced as I remembered. Leo had the exact same ones. For a few seconds, I thought Leo was pranking me. But no, the voice was too different. He stepped within inches of me, revealing his real face and grinning maliciously. This was not Leo. Panic surged as I backed away, stumbling into the tent. I rifled through the backpack, my fingers fumbling for the flare gun. Just as I grasped it, the man grabbed my foot sticking out of the tent. Then I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my leg. A severe tingling sensation in my leg felt like a strong electric shock, burning, and I screamed in pain. I glanced down and saw a knife embedded deep in my thigh. A scream tore from me as I grabbed the flare gun. He stepped back, but I didn't lower the weapon. I aimed directly at him. Blood oozed from my wound, staining the snow beneath me. I demanded to know where my friend was. The man's voice was calm, almost mocking, as he told me Leo was lying near the foot of the slope where we had been skiing. His words sent chills down my spine. He turned and sauntered away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods before I could fire a shot. My vision blurred from the pain, but I pressed down on my leg, trying to staunch the bleeding while I grabbed my phone and called 911. Just as I began to lose hope, a distant noise reached my ears. A rescue helicopter illuminated the snow-covered hills. With the little strength I had left, I fired the flare gun, the red light bursting into the sky. I mustered all my strength to tell them about Leo. He was found lying motionless on the hillside, his face pale. Blood stained his pants and the snow beneath him. A few days later, we were both recovering in the hospital, our wounds stitched up, but the memories remained vivid. We learned that our attacker was wanted for multiple assaults in remote areas, always hunting those who wandered too far from safety. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then, but something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day.
Mom, where are you? I'm cold.
That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard,
Mom, where are you?
I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered,
Mom, where is she?
I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate.
Where is my mom? I want to see her.
As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything. His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper.
Thank you.
I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me. It felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench. Sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school. But as I walked home, the excitement of Friday relieved me. Tomorrow was a day off from school. Finally, I could relax. As I approached home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left early that day for a business trip, so he must have rushed and forgotten to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence of the house welcomed me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the whole place to myself felt like freedom. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I settled in for a night of video games and movies. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my game. The house was quiet except for the occasional noise from the TV. I decided to get a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The light in the garage was on again. I paused. A strange, eerie feeling washed over me. Had I forgotten to turn it off? Or had my mom come home? But I hadn't heard her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my footsteps feeling heavy. As I stepped into the garage, every drawer in my dad's workshop was open. His tools were scattered across the floor as if someone had frantically searched for something, but there was no one here. I quickly turned back inside, locking the garage door. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I prepared to head back to the living room, planning to try to watch TV to calm down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattle violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was chilling. It was too quiet. I ran straight for the front door. My only thought was to escape. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze in my tracks. He was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped a hatchet, likely taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking the sound of my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going back upstairs was impossible. I quietly turned around and headed for the back door, trying to remain calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried to my neighbor's house, knocking on the door until they let me in. I waited there, heart pounding, watching my house from across the street as I prayed the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I knocked on my neighbor's door, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. It felt like an eternity before Mr. Thompson finally opened the door, his face etched with confusion. I recounted everything that had happened to him. His eyes widened, and without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat. He was determined to check my house for me, assuring me that everything would be okay. I reluctantly stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body still trembled with fear, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, with my dad's hatchet in hand, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, using the flashlight to scan the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside, and from across the street, a small voice echoed back, "There's no one there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I still needed to remain vigilant. As Mr. Thompson started to walk toward me, I felt that lingering anxiety return. Before I could voice my concerns, a dark figure shifted behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the shadows of the house. With an axe glinting under the dim porch light, I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned around, the intruder lunged at him. A fierce struggle ensued. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear as I watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson tried to deliver a solid blow with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder howled in pain, but instead of backing off, he raised the axe, ready to attack. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. In that moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson landed another blow, throwing the intruder off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens rang out. The intruder looked up at the sound of the sirens, and in a final effort to escape, he sprinted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, breathing heavily but still standing strong. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they had subdued him. The man thrashed wildly, growling like a wild beast, but the police quickly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the whole scene unfold. Mr. Thompson walked over to me, holding his side where he had been hit, but he still managed to smile. "You're safe now." I felt grateful, as if I had been saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted to do was forget. I sat down on Mr. Thompson's porch, my body shaking, watching the man being driven away in the police car. It was all over, but the image of the intruder's face, his wild eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing his hand on my shoulder for reassurance. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would linger with me. I would never forget how close I had come to being trapped in the grip of something truly evil. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us. Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here. Something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine. A quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple: get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, he struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people. I whispered, fumbling for my phone. "Casey, we need to call the police." Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. "They're trying to get in," I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. "Call the police," I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, "We need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door." With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. No, with a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. "End and year and ye and Andra." I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. We need to get to the car. We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rear-view mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier. hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end.